Welcome, everyone. I'm Rebecca Goldbert, the Executive Director of the Helen Diller Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies. We welcome you to a special webinar entitled Consolidation and Rifts in Current Israeli Society, New Findings from the Israeli Consensus Index. Today, we will host a panel of Israeli scholars from Bar-Ilan University, examining key data from the February 2024 Israeli Consensus Index, a representative national survey that measures attitudes and relationships within the Jewish and Arab Israeli population. We bring you this program in partnership with the Menomadin Center for Jewish and Democratic Law at Bar-Ilan University Faculty of Law. This semester, the Helen Diller Institute is continuing to explore the impact of war and the questions facing Israel and the region in several different ways. Bear with me while I share several of our spring programs. Last week, in part one of a two-part webinar series, legal scholars Manal Totri-Jubran and Masua Sagiv explored the impact of the Israel-Hamas War on the Arab-Palestinian community in Israel from a social, political, and legal perspective, with a particular focus on discrimination, rights, and remedies, and the complexities of citizenship. On April 15, in part two of this webinar series, education scholar Ayman Agbaria will continue this important conversation with Masua Sagiv from a civic educational perspective, with a focus on citizenship, education, religion, and belonging. In addition, we will have a two-part series on international law perspectives on the war. On April 1st, we will examine Israel before international law mechanisms with international law scholars Yuval Shani and Elena Chachko. On April 10th, we will zero in on the sexual and gender-based violence on October 7th and its aftermath with law and gender scholars Kochav El-Chayam Levi and Masua Sagiv. We will also continue our long tradition of programming in Jewish law, thought, and identity. On April 3rd, we will host in person our annual Robbins Collection Lecture on Jewish Law, Thought, and Identity with Yehuda Kurtzer, president of the Shalom Hartman Institute. We will also be hosting a conversation in person with author Yossi Klein Halevi and Professor Ethan Katz on April 15th. Lastly, we continue to invest in our students with a cohort of 30 undergraduate fellows engaging in leadership training, including how to have difficult conversations and how to engage across difference, and planning relevant programs for their peers. Please refer to our website, social media, and our email blast for all of these upcoming programs and for recordings of past programs. All of the programs, activities, and events of our institute are dependent on philanthropic support from the community. We thank you for your continued support. Now I'm honored to introduce you to Masua Sagiv, our moderator for today's program. The Helen Diller Institute has been blessed to host Professor Sagiv these past 3 years as the CRET Visiting Assistant Professor of Jewish and Israel Studies. She is also the scholar in residence at the Shalom Hartman Institute. We're thrilled to host Masua Sagiv for the coming academic year as well. As you heard, she is expertly moderating several programs for us this spring. Professor Sagiv researches and teaches on gender, religion, and law, gender and Judaism, law and social change, and comparative constitutional law. Before coming to Berkeley, Masua Sagiv was the academic director for the Menomadin Center for Jewish and Democratic Law, and she has deep connections to our speakers on today's panel. I turn the floor to her to introduce them.
Thank you, Rebecca. Hi, everyone. I'm really glad to be having this program today with the center that was my home for a long time, and in many aspects is still my home. And I really think that the mission of the Menomadin Center in Bar-Ilan University is more important these days than ever. I want to also thank Elad Kaplan, the director of the Menomadin Center, for really planning this program and helping and really making it happen. As Rebecca said before, last week we had a webinar with Dr. Manal Totri-Jubran, who's also, by the way, is affiliated by with the Menomadin Center. And we talked about Israeli society after October 7th, specifically about the Arab-Palestinian community in Israel. And we talked about the great and grave challenges of citizenship, of nationality, of discrimination. And today's panel is looking at these questions from a perspective of consensus building. And it is based on a national survey, a national index that was conducted in the last 2 months by the Menomadin Center in Bar-Ilan University, examining cohesions and divisions in Israel's diverse society. So we'll see the data from the index, and we'll hear interpretations and analysis and initiatives that are on the ground right now, helping build consensus in Israel. And we'll hear about these things from both a legal and social perspective. So I have the pleasure of presenting our speakers. They will speak one after the other. First, we have Dr. Julia Elad-Strenger, is a political psychologist and an assistant professor in the Department of Political Studies in Bar-Ilan University. Her research focuses on the psychology of public opinion, attitudes, and attitude change in 2 central domains. The first is political ideology, polarization, and radicalization. And the second is the psychology of intergroup conflicts on the inter and intra-national levels. Dr. Elad-Strenger is the lead researcher of the Consensus Index, and she will speak about the Israeli Consensus Index. She'll speak about examining cohesion and divisions in a diverse society. After Julia, we'll hear from Shahar Lifshitz, who is a professor of law at Bar-Ilan University, Faculty of Law. He was the dean, he's the former dean of the faculty and head of the Menomadin Center for Jewish and Democratic Law, which he founded as a branch of the faculty. He also advises to the Israeli Ministry of Justice in his fields of expertise. Professor Lifshitz has established, jointly with retired President of the Supreme Court, Justice Dorit Beinish, a forum for cooperation between the academic sphere and the Israeli Supreme Court. His fields of research include family law, contract law, inheritance law, Jewish law, multiculturalism, and human rights. And Professor Lifshitz will speak about building consensus on issues of state and religion in Israel, and he'll give us both a personal and a theoretical framework. Dr. Ori Aronson is an associate professor of law at Bar-Ilan University, and the next speaker, he's also a visiting research scholar at the Harvard Center for Jewish Studies. He studies constitutional law and adjudication, and he will speak about a constitutionalism of rebuilding. And last but not least, Dr. Tzili Elitzur-Naeh is a public policy director at the Menomadin Center for Jewish and Democratic Law and a postdoctoral fellow at Bar-Ilan University Faculty of Law. She's a former doctoral research fellow at the Hebrew University Faculty of Law and a former attorney and legal counsel at the Israeli Ministry of Justice. Her research focuses on conflict resolution and administrative law. Dr. Elitzur-Naeh will speak about improving social cohesion and enhancing trust through the courts. She will speak about hidden opportunities in the High Court of Justice. We invite everyone to write their questions throughout the way through the Q&A, and we will collect them, and we'll, after our panel will convene, everyone will come back and we'll have a discussion. We'll have a nice time of discussion. Julia, do you want to start?
Yes, good morning, I guess, everybody. Thank you for having me here. I'm very happy to talk about our project. All right, let me see. You can see my screen, I hope. All right. Okay, so today I'm going to discuss very briefly some of our findings from the Consensus Index. I'm going to present it a little bit. And I'm going to start just by saying a few words about Israeli society. Many of you are familiar, but many people outside Israel are not aware of the extent to which Israel is a diverse society. Israel, nationally speaking, only about 75% of Israelis are Jews. The rest are Arabs, and they're divided within themselves to many religions. And also we have 5% of people who are neither Jews nor Arabs. And within the Jewish community, we have a lot of subdivisions. So first of all, the religious cleavage, we're very divided on religious grounds in Israel. Of course, ideologically as well, with the majority being right-wing. and ethnically also quite divided. And there are two dominant groups, the Sephardi, Mizrahi Jews, who are the Jews who are originating from North Africa, from the Middle East, and Ashkenazi Jews who come mostly from Europe, some from the United States, North America. And Israel has always been also quite polarized along these cleavages, the national, ideological, religious, and ethnic, with many events that transpired in the last decades, which added to that polarization and exacerbated the intra-societal conflicts along these cleavages. Zooming in just on the last 5 years, we had 5 rounds of elections. We had a judicial reform or overhaul, as you choose to view it. We had numerous military operations, and currently we have a war on various fronts. And even COVID was a source of intra-societal conflict in Israel, particularly along the religious cleavage. So such a diverse and turbulent society is a very interesting case study for the question of how we conceptualize, understand, and measure societal cohesion and divisions, and how we should intervene to foster more agreements and reduce intra-societal conflict. So collaborating with Professor Lifshitz and Professor Aronson and others, we embarked on a project to develop a tool or a comprehensive data set for assessing cohesion and divisions in Israeli society, which can be used, we hope it will be used as an invaluable resource for guiding practical interventions. So a few words about this index. First and foremost, this index is based on a multi-dimensional conceptualization and operationalization of cohesion and divisions in society. So we measure different aspects and manifestations of cohesion and divisions and include many validated and highly sophisticated measures of the causes and implications thereof. So just to give a few examples for different aspects of cohesion, we measured identification with different subgroups in society and with superordinate categories, such as being Israeli or Jewish. We measured perceived division and cohesions and also actual divisions and cohesion through agreement and disagreements on contested issues, intergroup relations on various domains and aspects. We also take a multi-cleavage approach. So we measure all our variables across all main societal cleavages in Israel simultaneously. And this allows us to see how these cleavages are related to one another, affect one another, overlap or cross-cut, and which cleavages have the strongest influence on the general cohesion in society at different time points. And this leads me to the third point of measuring cohesion and divisions periodically over time to assess what happens to different aspects of cohesion among different groups over time, and particularly following various major events. So until now, we had 6 waves of measurement in the most heated period in Israel lately. So from September 19 until now, January, February 2024, the 3 first waves are a panel study, so the same participants measured 3 times, and 3 waves thereafter.
Dr. Elad-Strenger, are you back with us?
Yes, I'm back. What did we miss? Oh no.
Great. We 2 seconds ago. We lost you only 2 seconds ago. So you can carry on where you were.
Okay, just 1 second. I'm sorry. Okay, so just an important thing to say that our waves of measurement are always based on nationally representative samples, more than 2,000 participants, which is quite a lot, including, of course, Jews and Arabs. We focus on identity and subjective identification as a basis for divisions and not demographics. And we have a core questionnaire plus questions that tap into salient topics in each wave: the war, the judicial reform, democracy, etc. Okay, so I want to share with you some key findings that we had. Just to give you a taste of what we do and what we uncovered, and it's important that it's just a taste because we're limited in time. The first thing when we talk about identities and societal cleavages in Israel, one thing we see, of course, is that Jewish and Arab identification are antagonistic, means they're negatively correlated. People who identify as Jews don't identify as Arabs, but it's not completely so, because some Jews, especially from North Africa, they also identify to some extent as Arabs. But what is important here is that Israeli identification, which is supposed to be a superordinate category that allegedly should bring about, it's a common identity that could reduce conflict, is also maybe a source of conflict, because while most Jews identify very highly as Israeli, a very small minority of Arabs do. Another finding with regard to identities and social cleavages is that in the Jewish sector, the religious, the ethnic, and the ideological cleavages are reinforcing, meaning that people who identify as religious also identify as Mizrahi and as right-wing, and vice versa for seculars who identify more as Ashkenazi and more as left-wing. And here too, with regard to superordinate identities, we see that the religious Mizrahi right-wing sector in Israel, if you could call it that, see themselves as more Jewish than Israeli, while the other camp see themselves as more Israeli than Jewish. And so these superordinate identifications or categories, which are supposed to bring us together, at least in the Jewish sector, can also become a source of conflict. We conducted actually a proper cluster analysis within the Jewish sector to examine whether we can indeed identify two tribes in Israeli society that encompass individuals' identities across all three cleavages, and what are the differences between these tribes. And indeed, we identified these two tribes that are mirror images of one another. The Israeli tribe, we call it, are less right-wing than the other tribe, more left-wing, less religious, more secular, etc. And the other camp, the mirror image, is the Jewish camp. They're also more Jewish than the other camp, more Jewish than Israeli, etc. But we also identified a third tribe, which is, in terms of identification, always in the middle. And what we show, or what we demonstrate in our findings, I'm not going to talk about it much today, is that the Jewish tribe, the tribe of the Jews, is driving or triggering or more responsible for the ideological and national conflicts in Israel in terms of their intergroup attitudes, etc. But the Israeli camp, it takes a much stronger role in the religious conflict in Israeli society. What is interesting is that the Jewish Israeli tribe, this orange tribe in the middle, is always, what we find is that it always supports more agreements and more compromises, and that could be a key for agreements. If you want, in the Q&A, we can discuss this. But I want to share with you some findings about cohesion and divisions in Israeli society. Across domains, cleavages, and time points. And here I will focus on our three last waves of measurement. And what is important about the three waves of measurement is that between wave 4 and 5, we had the judicial reform or overhaul. This was very dominant in Israeli society. And between wave 5 and 6, we had the war in October 2023. It started, and our measurement was in January and February 2024. Okay, so here you can see, first of all, participants' answers on forced choice items, in which we ask them to choose which group along each cleavage they identify with more. So these self-identified group memberships guided us in all our segmentations and our analysis. And what you can see here is the dramatic divisions along these cleavages: the ideological cleavage, the religious cleavage, and the ethnic cleavage. So here, for example, we asked participants to what extent do they think Israel is divided along these cleavages. And you see participants' answers based on their self-chosen group membership. So in general, what we see here is the internal political crisis around the judicial reform between May 2021 and May 2023 increased perceived divisions along some cleavages, whereas the war decreased perceived divisions, meaning it created higher perceived cohesion in Israeli society across most cleavages. However, if we look more closely, we see a much more complex picture. So with regard to the national division between Jews and Arabs, we see that for Jews, there was almost no change in the extent to which they saw Israel as divided along the national dimension. But for Arabs, we see an increase during the judicial reform and a sharp increase during the war. If we look at the ideological divide, there was almost no change in perceptions of divisions along ideological lines throughout the judicial reform, which may be surprising, but a sharp decrease during the war. When we look at the religious cleavage, we see that only the seculars saw the reform as increasing religious divisions in society, but not the religious. So we see divergence in perspectives between the groups along each cleavage, and this is a very important point. Now, we saw that many people think that divisions in society are currently decreasing during the war, but is it actually so? So what actually happens in people's perceptions of their identities and of one another? So let's look at the extent to which people identify as Israelis, which is an important superordinate identity with the potential to reduce intra-societal tensions. So we're looking here at the percentages of people who strongly identify as Israeli. And this graph right here is the general Israeli society. So for the population as a whole, we see a slight rise in identification as Israelis, particularly from before to during the war. But when you look group by group, again, we see a more complex picture. First, this increase in Israeli identification is most pronounced among Arabs right here and is almost neglectable among Jews. Second, we can see that leftists went up in identification to the level of rightist, with the bigger shift happening following the reform and not following the war. Third, the distance between seculars and religious in terms of Israeli identification actually grew during the war. We also asked participants to what extent they think Israelis could reach agreement on contested issues across each cleavage. And we see an increase among all groups from before to during the war, except for Jews with regard to agreements with Arabs. So in general, despite the potentially optimistic increase in the perceived potential for agreements, we still see a divergence between groups which actually grew between Jews and Arabs and left and right during the war. We also asked how important it is for participants that such agreements are reached. There seemed to be an increase from before to during the war in general with the general population. But again, when we look more closely, the increase is only significant among Arabs and negligible among others. As a final example, despite the increase in willingness for agreements and in perceptions of cohesion, there is only a tiny increase in positive emotions towards the outgroup along each cleavage from before to during the war, with actually a decrease in positive emotions among Jews towards Arabs. We measured emotions on a feeling thermometer, where 0 represents very negative emotions, 100 highly positive emotions, and 50 is neutral. So in fact, despite the slight increase you see here everywhere in positive emotions, in 5 out of 8 cases, the emotions are still below the neutral line, as you see, below 50. So the emotions are still negative. So the final slide is just to say that if we want to measure cohesion and divisions in a diverse society such as Israel, it's very important to distinguish different societal cleavages, measuring them simultaneously, to differentiate groups within each cleavage, to differentiate domains or aspects of cohesion and division, because each of them behaves differently, and to measure this across various time points. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. In October 7, Israel was brutally attacked by Hamas terrorists. and experience a severe threat. In the year before October 7, Israel experienced a severe internal division, dispute that almost tear Israeli society. There are clear connections between these two events. First, rational connection or causality and linkage is that Israeli society was focused on the internal debate and was not ready for the external threat. Second, our enemies perceived our internal debate as a signal that Israeli society become weak, and they hope that the attack can work. But as a Jew who is very rooted in Israel, in Jewish history and tradition, I would say that in all the rabbinical literature, there is this linkage between internal debate and external disaster. Like, as you know, the second temple, according to the rabbinical lecture, was destroyed because of internal hate between the Jews to themselves. For this reason, our topic today and the questions how Israel society can get into building consensus process is crucial. It is crucial, in my opinion, to the very ability of Israeli society to exist. And for this reason, I would like in my very short talk to share with you my own experience as someone that was personally involved in some major past experience of building consensus. One regarding establishing civil marriage in Israel. Second, I was involved in the effort of IDI, Israeli Democratic Institute, to propose a consensual constitution. And third, during the political debate of last year, I was involved in a team that tried to help the president of Israel, Yitzhak Herzog, to advise or to establish kind of consensual program to get out from the constitutional crisis. Now, all the examples that I provide failed. This means that in Israel there is no civil marriage yet. In Israel there is no constitution, and the legal crisis, the constitutional crisis, stopped just because there was a war. But I still want to make kind of reflection on those effort and effort of others, and try to characterize what are the main challenges if we really want to become a society that getting to kind of building consensus. And I want to focus on three aspects: philosophical, analytical, social, educational, and institutional. So we will begin with the intellectual one. If I will focus on the religion and state debate in Israel, or the tensions that Julia just mentioned between religious and non-religious, or between liberal and conservative, one of the big challenges is to learn to characterize the difference between core vision that you are not able to compromise, that are your red line, to other vision and stance and positions that you are ready to that you are ready to compromise about. For example, if you look at it from religious perspective, Rabbi Yaakov Medan, who was part of a very famous trial to make compromise an issue of religion and state, he was part of what is considered the covenant of Gabizon and Medan, and one of it is a rabbi, and he proposed that in Israel there will be a kind of Chilul Shabbat, or violation of Ilchatic Shabbat rule regarding cultural event, but not according to commercial activities in Saturday. And in one of his talk, he described how he was criticized from his own audience, which tell him that tell him, how dare you, in which authority you are able to compromise about religious principles. At the same time, when when in America there was kind of a debate about same-sex marriage, and there was one compromise solution that there will be civil union or domestic partnership, Ronald Dworkin can say, I don't understand it. If the title marriage is important, why should same-sex couple give up about it? If it is not important, why the religious insists that they will not get it? So it is very smart argument, but it means that we can't compromise about anything, because if something is important, then how can we compromise about it? And if it is not important, so it is not important to anyone. So both liberal and non-liberal must share the same public arena and must ask themselves, if they really want to continue the project of joint life in Israel, what are the criteria for them to get compromised? I can tell you that I was in my own synagogue, and there was a very exciting evening about the war and about the personal experience of the war, and the attendants, who most of them are parents of Israeli soldiers currently in Gaza, talk about how important it for them and for the unity in Israeli society, and how civil society is now very unique. And then I told them, look, it is very important that Israeli people are fighting together, and that during the war they learned how unitary is important, but we cannot forget that we have different vision in a very core issue. So the real question that you must ask yourself is, which kind of dreams and visions are you ready to give us, at least partly, because your own dream or vision is the other person's threat or even nightmare. And if you are not willing to do this, all of this talking about unity are empty talk. 1 week later, I went to conference of a legal activist who celebrate the last case of the Supreme Court, which invalidate the reasonability rule, the one that deny Supreme Court to supervise the reasonability of the governance actions. And then one of the and then I asked them the same and then few of them criticize the court that say that they invalidate this version, but what about, but they would accept my version, and then say, look, why the court should be weak, why he hint to the other side that he will be ready to get a mild version, we have to be very strong and that we are not ready to anything. So the first mission of Israeli society is to learn to get compromised and to learn that not everything that we want is something that we are not able to compromise. My last point is that beyond the intellectual move, there should be also social move of getting to know each other, to know the other tribe, and beyond of this, because media and Supreme Court and social network are such institutions that encourage dispute and extreme view, we must develop alternative institutions that encourage also cooperation and getting compromise. And I think that Tzili is going to speak about this point. So my final word is Israel, in my opinion, get in this war second and maybe last opportunity to work about its internal strength. We shouldn't miss this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shahar, and Rebecca, and Muslan, everybody, and Yulia for the amazing results. So hi again, my name is Aronson from Bar-Ilan as well. Currently at the East Coast in the afternoon. I also have a partially personal take on the issue. As a person who's been deeply involved in the efforts to object against the judicial reform of the government prior to October 7th. And I think one way to describe the experience of those of us who were involved in the efforts against the government's proposals was that for us as well, this has been somewhat of a moment of reckoning. In what sense? Let me explain. Many of the arguments we presented in opposition to the government's efforts have dealt with trust that we suggested is worth maintaining with institutions of professional expertise, such as courts, legal advisors, and other bureaucrats. And indeed, we saw the government's assault on Israeli democratic institutions as resembling other efforts by populist governments around the world to limit the power of professional elements in governance generally, not only courts. And the main argument being that if we do that, we will just see a decimation of the public administration and full politicization of governance, perhaps to the benefit of specific in-groups, but not for the benefit of the general welfare and long-term welfare of the Israeli population. Now, given October 7th, obviously one of the aspects of that incredible trauma was realizing that some of the most established institutions of, say, professional credibility in Israel have obviously failed in their operations. And that requires kind of this reckoning and asking, so to what extent should we still stand behind kind of this full support of technocracy, of bureaucratic expertise as a block against political overreach? It doesn't mean to say that I think that this is not an argument about any justifiability for the judicial overhaul. In fact, at least the way I understand the motivations there, they had nothing to do with the quality of Israeli governance. But it does call upon us to rethink the future of Israeli constitutional structures, given the fact of the failure of what we perceived as pure technocratic expertise. And if or when Israel arrives at what many of us call sort of the day after, when the war subsides and Israel manages to return to a project of gaining a sense of normalcy, I would argue that it would have to face three challenges of rebuilding. All three have to do with deeply constitutional questions. So in that sense, kind of tying into the fights and arguments we held before the war began. Israel will require first to engage in a rebuilding of its actual institutions of governance. We saw diverse failures. We still see some of them today in coping with the challenges of Israeli society after the war. And a project will have to be engaged in rebuilding the institutions in a way that would make them more robust to the challenges of reality of the region, of the politics of this era, and not subject to the possibility of failure of the kinds we saw. So rebuilding of the failed institutions themselves. A second project of rebuilding would have to do with the perception of the population towards the government itself. So we're talking basically about rebuilding of trust of people in government. Interestingly, a few of the findings in the index that Julia presented had to do, for example, with the two seemingly contrasting notions. One, she didn't present this, but I can add a few points of data. One finding was that Israelis post-October 7 believe that Israel's democracy is in a better shape than it was before. Now, this can be explained just because we're no longer facing this kind of outright assault against democracy by the government. But that's interesting, given another finding there that has to do with the very sort of diminished trust of Israelis of all sectors in the government itself, right? So we have this sense that things could work, right? But we do not trust the people actually holding these jobs. And the challenge here in terms of constitutionalism would be to create means for people to rekindle their trust, both in the capacity of institutions to operate for the public benefit, but also not only that, but also in the sort of good faith of public office holders to seek public welfare. So rebuilding institutions, rebuilding trust in institutions. And then the third challenge that ties it all together and ties directly to the previous presentations is rebuilding the ties among the communities and citizens in Israel themselves. Again, a few important findings from Julia's index. We saw a little bit of that, sort of the more kind of optimistic version that has to do with the perception of Arab Israelis. With regard to the possibility of collaboration or living together, so some improvement there. On the other hand, we have several indices showing a greater amount of sense of fear or suspicion from Jews in Israel vis-a-vis the Arab minority. So again, we see these two conflicting forces, and obviously they can be explained in the immense trauma faced by the Israeli society post-October 7. But to rebuild institutions and to rebuild trust, people's trust in these institutions, we're going to have to find a way to get people together with each other so that when they engage in their normal civic social life, they also they're not subject to ongoing sense of fear and suspicion in the other. My argument to tie these three projects of rebuilding, institutions, trust, and social ties together has to do, again, with democracy. Not the kind of democracy argued by the government in its promotion of the judicial overhaul, saying, let's just let majorities decide and forget about any other institutional safeguards. No. So the kind of majority these projects of constitutionalisms of rebuilding call for are, to my view, processes of democratizing governmental decision-making in itself. So the challenge would be to think of new forms of governance that are more self-critical, more experimental, more amenable to local influence, more participatory, bringing people together to review governmental policies and to affect the way they are both designed and deployed. And when we do that, also re-engaging people in this kind of civic discourse, which was perhaps a single silver lining from the judicial overhaul period, where we saw people actually engaged in their civic identity even beyond their individual or group identifications. So if there's anything that we could possibly take from the difficult month even before October 7th, I would hope it would be this kind of form of civic engagement that we saw from people of all walks of life in Israel, and try to exploit that sense of civic membership, again, also seen to some extent in Julia's findings, to design a new constitutional framework for Israel that establishes both more robust institutions, but also serves as a basis for a new and improved social tie among communities in Israel. Thank you.
Just a second. Just a second. Okay. Hi, I'm Tzili. I'm very happy to be here. Okay, I hope you see my screen. And I will somehow connect to what Ori said, but from a different angle. And I will discuss improving social cohesion through the courts with a question mark, and share with you my perspective of hidden opportunities in the Israeli High Court of Justice, Bagatz. Well, what do the courts have to do with social fractures and decreased trust in the public authorities? I think the common answer would probably be that courts usually harm relationships and possibly make these fractures even worse. I think that in the case of the Israeli society, this common answer seems even more persuasive, since during 2023, before October 7th, the Supreme Court, and especially its judicial review public law function, the High Court of Justice, Bagatz, was at the heart of a very heated and polarized public struggle around the government's judicial reform or overhaul. These are the pictures that many of us were inside, okay? So, according to these recent events, okay, here is the HCJ in the heart of this controversy. And according to these recent events, it seems that courts, and especially the HCJ in Israel, are really polarizing social institutions by definition. However, following findings from my PhD research of the HCJ, I would like to suggest that under certain conditions, judicial review courts could play a very different social role of improving social cohesion, improving relationships, and enhancing trust in public authorities. So, just a second. Okay, the HCJ, Bagatz, is one function of the Israeli Supreme Court when discussing public law disputes and performing judicial review over the government and other public authorities' decisions. As a central Israeli institution, eventually discussing all of the Israeli society's most heated debates, the public image of the HCJ is very adversarial and usually related to the controversy over judicial activism. However, previous empirical research indicates a vast culture of settlement at the HCJ. It's a hidden culture at the HCJ, which is you know, a common term in research of considerable rates of cases disposed by settlement between the parties, and widespread settlement promotion activity within the auspices of the court. For example, here we can see that according to Dotan's findings, out of a representative sample of HCJ cases from the 90s, that only about 40% of the cases were disposed by a final court decision, and the other cases were disposed by, they were settled and not ended with the final judgment. So after reading these findings, and alongside, indications to rare HCJ cases that are referred to mediation, in my research, in my research, I examined recent HCJ settlement promotion activity from a conflict resolution perspective. So, first, I composed a representative sample of judicial review cases at the Supreme Court, HCJ cases, and also appeals over the administrative district court judgments. And I read all of these 496 cases and coded them. I coded the way it was disposed. And regarding settlement resolution, I defined cases that ended like that as cases which disposed due to acceptance of the respondents of some of the petitioner's demands without a formal judicial order. So according to my findings, close to 40% of the cases now, in recent years in the HCJ, were disposed by settlement as I defined it, like essential settlements. And furthermore, examining the settlement promotion activity within the court, and without regard to the manner that cases disposed eventually, I got this interesting pyramid in which most of the, or a very large, almost half of the settled cases, they were disposed very early, based on direct communication between the parties, no judicial involvement at all. When we reach cases that reach judicial involvement further in the process, then I saw, or I got the findings that about 30% of these cases, judges were trying actively to get the parties to settle between them, doing several activities. I will not get to it here, And most interesting for me, I saw that very, very rare cases, but they exist, HCJ cases, they are referred to mediation, but very, really, really small fraction. And because mediation is not related at all to HCJ proceedings formally in Israel, not related at all. So it was very interesting for me. Like, why are these cases referred to this informal mediation? And I really looked for these rare cases, and from the entire caseload submitted between 2010 and 2022, I found 13 cases, that were referred informally to mediation by the HCJ. And I will share with you like the overall picture. So legally, from a legal perspective, these cases had no common legal subject. You can see like the relevant legal subjects. So I could see no common legal subject. But however, essentially, they all shared a common complexity, emotional sensitivity, and a significant need of, or significant need of practical solution to a severe problem. So these are the cases. and trying to understand why these specific cases were referred to mediation and what was the experience of the mediation like, I interviewed attorneys that took part in these mediations. And regarding the reason for referring these cases to mediation, the answers of the attorneys included repeated themes related to sensitivity, mistrust between the parties, and also differences regarding faith and values, or differences across the Israeli spectrum. This is a little bit more connected to, you know, the theme of this webinar. And relating to the question whether it was worth to try mediation, all the attorneys answered it was worth it without regard to the outcome of the mediation. Some mediations ended with an agreement and some did not. And in each case, the attorneys said it was worth it. So if I view these findings from a conflict resolution perspective, I see first of all a silent and informal infiltration of conflict resolution notions and procedures to the HCJ. Okay, but however, these procedures and settlement activity currently are randomly applied, informal, and unguided by conflict resolution professional knowledge. Okay? Therefore, assuming that collaborative processes are better adapted to some kinds of disputes, also large-scale disputes, I argue that institutionalization and institutionalizing such activity at the HCJ and other judicial review courts under guidance of conflict resolution professional knowledge may contribute significantly to enhancing trust in public authorities and improving both small-scale and large-scale relationships within society. And lastly, to connect to the consensus index data, I would like to refer to an interesting finding from the current data, that despite the heated struggle around the Supreme Court during 2023, when asked now to rate how much various agents increase polarization in Israeli society, most of the respondents, both Arabs and Jews, rated the Supreme Court as least polarizing. Okay, we can see it in red, least polarizing. And maybe this finding indicates an opportunity for the Supreme Court to enhance this public sentiment even further by developing a formal conflict resolution mechanism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tzili. Thank you, everyone. I want to invite our panelists back on the screen. Thank you, everyone, for your presentations and for really giving us different angles to what we're seeing. What I want to do now, we received several questions both through the Q&As and through different chats. But what I want to do is I'm consolidating some of the questions together. And if it's okay with you, I will just I'll give you some of the, you know what? No, I'm going to ask each of you a few questions, and then I'll move on to the next person. Okay. So, Julia, if we can start with you, I want you to please speak about two things. One, can you think what are your 3 takeaways from the index? And number 2, did the index relate to Israeli views regarding the conflict at all, or only inside Israel? And can you, and if not, can you say something about this specifically after October 7th? And I'll just mention here that we have received a question whether some of these, some of this data is published, and it's not yet, right, Julia?
Yes. So we will put, I guess, our main findings on the website of Menomadin later on. But of course, even this report is very partial. There's so much data here to take away, and that makes the first question a bit difficult. What are the 3 takeaways? So I'll start with the second question about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So we have a lot of data about that as well. What I can say that we found interesting in our findings about that is that, well, maybe expectedly, since October 7th, so from before to after October 7th, we do see a sharp decrease among Israeli Jews in their optimism, belief, and willingness for an agreement, a peace agreement with the Palestinians. But what was interesting is that among Israeli Arabs, we see kind of a more complex picture again, that on the one hand, just like among the Jews, there is an increase in negative emotions towards Palestinians among the Israeli Arabs. But among the Israeli Arabs, we do see an increase in the belief in how much an agreement, a peace agreement, is important and necessary for Israel's future. So that is kind of the complexity we saw among Israeli Arabs, and among Israeli Jews. We see also among the left a decrease in the willingness to support a peace agreement. With regard to the 3 takeaways, there is like the big picture. I would say that it's very important to see the complexity. I know I repeat that a lot. I am a political psychologist, and that's what we like to see, the complexity, and not to give like very simplistic bottom lines. So the methodological takeaway is that it depends, that we need to look at different groups, different divisions within Israeli society. The picture is very different for each of them, and at every different point in time. But in terms of content, my big takeaways is that actually the different events in Israeli society have different effects on our cohesion. So it's not that when there is a crisis, and we tend to think in these terms, when there is a crisis, then it brings everybody together. That's not what we see. And I think it's a very important takeaway that it depends which crisis. An internal political crisis, like the judicial overhaul reform, we see that it actually increased divisions in Israeli society, and also not all of them, mostly the ideological and the religious. And the war actually created more divisions between the Arabs and the Jewish Israelis, but maybe decreased, it depends on what aspect, decreased some of the other divisions. So this fantasy that we have of increased cohesion under crisis, that we should look in a more sophisticated way. I have more to say, but this could take forever. So I just suggest we continue.
Thank you, Julia, for now. And once we have more of the data published, you'll send it to us, and we'll also link it somehow to this to the recording of this event. Shahar, following what Julia said and your presentation, 2 questions that are probably a bit different but also overlap. One, we see the difference between Jewish perceptions towards Arab Palestinians and Arab Palestinians' perceptions towards Jewish, Jewish Israelis. How do you see the way you've been talking about building trust and building consensus? How do you see the way towards this path? How do you see the way to to cultivate this opportunity that seems to be presented with the Arab Palestinian population, where the suspicion, and Ori, you mentioned it too, where when the suspicion within the Jewish population is increasing as well? That's number one. And two, you know, and I also remember this when we were working together, we were very concerned about questions of Judaism and democracy and religion and state. And some of the questions also refer to this. What is the future in Israel of public discourse around these questions when we are faced with such a crisis of security and economy and an economic crisis that is probably also unfolding? So what's the future for that? How can we increase this discussion if you think it is important? And what is, I think, our role as well? You are muted.
Thank you for those two questions. I will begin with the first one. I believe that the index response teach us that there is great opportunity in the Israeli relationship between Jewish and Arabs, because two reasons. One is that Jewish in Israel, deep, sometimes unconscious concern is what will happen when Israel will be threatened by Arab nations and our enemies. What will Palestinian Arabs in Israel do? Would they be part of our enemies, or will they share our fate? And I think that in the recent October 7 event, it is clear that the Arab population in Israel are part of Israeli society. Of course, they concern about, like a lot of Jews in Israel, concern about pictures that we are seeing in Gaza, but at the same time, it was clear that they were shocked from the Hamas brutally. They share the feeling that it is a disaster. They were part of civil societies that tried to help from the very beginning. At least part of the Arabs also were involved in security activity. And my concern is that the Jewish are not returning back the hands that the Israeli Arabs are now offer, and I think it is a great opportunity, and we can fix it and correct it. And here we have opportunities that we shouldn't miss. Regarding the internal debate and the learned religions, so as I described, I believe that the external threat provide us second opportunity, because before October 7, there was a trend that one time was, there was kind of sentiment that in the past was just shared by extreme groups, but it became almost a trend to talk about dividing Israel into two cantons of, according to the Bible, Israel and Yehuda, and there was like a map that show this will be part of Yehuda, this will be part of Israel. And the problem is that no one remembered to get Hamas know these divisions, and that he should take just Judah and not Israel, or vice versa. And so in this sense, the external threat remind Israel societies that this talking about splitting is just not realistic in the current situation. At the same time, as I try to tell in my stories about both my lecture in my own shul, synagogue, and in the IDI conference, that it is not sufficient. If we are not going in the next step, if we are not going to think seriously what price we are willing to pay for living together, so we will stuck at the same point.
Thank you, Shahar. Ori, I have a few questions that were gathered for you, but before that, Tzili, I want to ask you, because I think it relates a bit. You've talked about the Supreme Court, and I wonder if you can speak more how you see the connection between the findings of the index to why should we aspire to have the Supreme Court in a role, play a role here? Like, why do you want us to turn into the Supreme Court? Or why do you think that this is already something that is happening, and maybe you want us to, maybe you want to move us in different ways? But maybe if you can speak to that.
Okay, thank you. It's a great question. I think I will combine, you know, what Shahar said, and I will base on it. I think that we need rebuilding, as Ori said also, and we need opportunities. And I think we also saw in the previous wave of the index, in the judicial, you know, judicial reform and overhaul wave, we saw and we all felt, everyone here in Israel felt how much the Supreme Court, and especially the HCJ, is really at the heart of the Israeli society, public arena. It was in the heart of a debate, but really it is in the heart of the society, really, really. And it's not by instance that the debate was about it, because it is so essential for the Israeli society. I think this is really the most essential institution in the Israeli society. And I think it can take both ways. And I think, as I try to show, I think that the way I'm suggesting is already there. Like, there is a potential. It is very silent, but it is there. And all we have to do is just make it grow, okay, and develop and be, you know, develop and to understand along the way what is the right way to do it and regarding which cases. But doing that within the HCJ, it has, you know, I think an immense symbolic value to the Israeli society, okay, to see that the court as an institution, he sees these values as important. He wants to enhance trust also in the court itself. He wants to approach every part of the Israeli society. And I think if the court will decide to do that, then it will have really a vast improvement in the Israeli society, and both practically and symbolically, and we need one.
I think that what is coming here very loud and clear so far is that that Israeli inner social cohesion is a crucial part of Israel's future, and is substantially connected to Israel's efforts also in the war outside, which is something that is very apparent in Israeli discourse. And of course, the Supreme Court and judicial overhaul or judicial reform was a very big part in the last year up to October 6th, and maybe even after. So Oli, I want to turn to you with three questions. One, do you think that the judicial overhaul or judicial reform is behind us, or is it still alive? We have seen in the past few days one law that was pretty periphery to the legislation package regarding municipal rabbis, but we see it resurface now. So whether this is something, will we see the judicial overhaul coming back? Connected to this, you've spoken about rebuilding civic engagement and ties between communities, and we've seen the results of the data regarding the Arab-Palestinian population. How do you see this working when the Arab-Palestinian population largely didn't participate in this awakening, the civic engagement awakening of the protest movement? They were largely outside of this and didn't really feel as if this is a part of as if they are a part of this. And the third question is that we have been seeing in the past few weeks an increase or a return of the Israeli protest movement. It's definitely not in the same scale as before. It's different. It's not against the judiciary, the legislation package. But how do you feel when you're talking about, again, rebuilding civic engagement and trust? How do you feel about protesting now during a war? Is it time to protest? Is it not? What are your sentiments about this?
Thank you. If I may, just before saying a word about each of the three super difficult questions, Overtutai, Shahar, and Tzili's answers to your questions. So Shahar said, it's a role now of the Jews to reach out, kind of sort of to reciprocate the way Israeli Arabs have been reacting to this trauma. And then you asked Tzili, so how come legal institutions should be part of this? Usually we say, legal law or courts are like the worst place in which to engage these kinds of questions. A way to perhaps tie these issues together, one of the most, to me, dispiriting slides or findings in Julia's study, also not presented here, but was asking Israeli Jews what extent, what share of Israeli Jews believe that Israeli Arabs supported the Hamas attack. And the share was very, very large. It's and completely sort of inaccurate when actually measured against the perceptions, the beliefs of Israeli Arab. Just to say that this expectation that communities will somehow just reach out and Jews will suddenly want to engage with Arabs without any structural kind of work done, I think that's just sadly unrealistic. And one of the answers to that would say, well, actually law, with all its kind of procedures and formalities, could actually be a way of establishing kind of basic modes of interaction when kind of, emotional reaching out is not likely to take place. In that sense, I also have this kind of newfound hope that actually legal structures may have some potential in this rebuilding process, kind of counter to our often sort of intuition that law is like the worst place to deal with these kinds of questions, and the court is part of that, but not only courts. Obviously, there are other legal means to engage in that. Just speaking generally, in terms of your question, so judicial reform, I'd say, although many people say it's continuing in different ways, I think it's safe to say, and we kind of see it also in the index, because Israelis seem to feel less anxious about democracy or about institutions. It's true that sort of the big threats to like the complete abolishment, basically, of separation of powers in Israeli constitutional structure. So this doesn't seem to be on the table now anymore. So in that sense, kind of the large structural constitutional stakes, I'd say, are lower. And also we see this in the way protest is taking place and its focus. At the same time, kind of the, say, ideological forces that pushed for the overhaul obviously are still here and now can draw on new sources of tension, of animus, of fear and suspicion among communities. And some of this we see, obviously in the way the police is being deployed, in the way the court itself is quite wary of reviewing governmental actions now that affect rights for civil protests, for freedom of speech, to some extent the issue of the treatment of Palestinian detainees in Israel since the war. Again, issues that we would expect kind of a classic court to be highly involved in, and we haven't seen that institution active as well. So kind of the concern is that even without kind of the formal structural changes, reality itself has affected or has impacted severely the way separation of powers in Israel is exercised, and that's a thing that we should still be tracking and sort of concerned with it. Anyone concerned with sort of the viability of Israeli democracy even after the war. Now, obviously, what you're saying is correct, and we have lots of information about this, that Israeli Arabs were mostly absent from sort of the major activities during the judicial overhaul for various reasons. And that just says that there's still lots of work to do, right? So we don't have everybody on board in the sense of this kind of awakening to the importance of constitutional questions. Having said that, again, this is kind of the optimistic part that we see from the index, is that we actually, as Julia mentioned, right, the only sector that we can see sort of significant shifts in their perception of the likelihood of collaboration within Israeli society are Israeli Arabs, right? So something happened there that sort of, not all of them obviously, but there's sort of a larger share of Israeli Arabs that somehow perceive themselves as having a stake in Israeliness. And so maybe that's something to draw upon. And about protests, well, sort of you might, I guess you alluded it from points I already made. Democracies at war face special threats to democracy, right? And obviously protest is one of the ways to signal that something that could be troublesome is going on. Again, this is the time that we cannot fully trust the classic institutions like a court or legal advisors who are often kind of engaged in the general support of the governmental action. And therefore, in that sense, I'd say protest now is quite important. And obviously, counting also the cost of it to social cohesion. But I mean, these are times in which we should not sort of give up on making sure that our institutions are still committed to democratic principles. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe just one last, Shahar, I would love to hear what you think about this specific point about is it the right time for protesting right now or not?
I don't know. I really don't know. I do think that preventing of protesting in the name of unitary, it is a bad thing. At the same time, I feel that there is like one shot, and if it will be too early about too many topics, it will be missed in a way. So I'm not sure that this is part of my expertise or that I have very wise thing to tell about this.
Thank you very much, everyone, for this panel and for joining us for this conversation, which really, I think, sheds a light to what Israeli society is navigating right now, because we've been hearing a lot, about the war and about October 7th and about the impact of October 7th on the different societies in Israel. But I think that navigating questions that have been there before October 7th and will keep on being with us way after, I think it is, it's very important. It's very important to put the time to have this conversation. And I want to thank you, everyone, for joining us. Rebecca, I'm giving this back to you.
Thank you. I also want to thank everyone. I want to thank Yulia and Ori and Shahar and Tzili for presenting. And I want to thank you, Masua, for expertly navigating the Q&A and asking questions that teased out some more of the data as well. And thank you also to the Menomadin Center for the collaboration on this program.
Thank you.
Thank you.